Snow lashed against the side of the barn, each gust carrying knives of ice that cut through her ragged shawl. Evelyn Whitmore, daughter of a once proud rancher, stumbled through the storm, her boots sinking into drifts that swallowed her calves. She had wrapped herself in what little remained from her ruined home, just a smoke-stained shawl and her father's old coat, but the bitter wind pierced through it as though she were wearing nothing at all. The land around her stretched in every direction, endless, white, merciless. Her father's ranch had been her whole world, a proud sprawl of fences, cattle, and wheat fields that once glowed gold in summer. But now, blackened timbers and smoldering ash marked where the house had stood. The fire had come fast, sweeping through the dry wood like a beast unleashed, leaving her with nothing but the smell of charred memories. The barn had been spared by chance. Standing stubborn and weathered against the storm, she pressed her hand against its frozen door, her knees buckling. Every breath rattled through her chest like brittle glass, each exhale forming pale clouds that dissolved in the wind. The storm screamed around her, filling her ears until even the sound of her own heartbeat seemed to fade. She told herself she just needed shelter, just a moment of rest before she found anyone to help. But her body had stopped listening. Her muscles refused her. She sagged against the barn wall, and the white world blurred into gray shadows. Somewhere inside, the horses shifted. Their hooves stamped the packed earth, nervous and restless. That faint sound tethered her to consciousness, a reminder of life beyond the biting cold. She clawed at the door with numb fingers, forcing it open just enough to stumble inside. The sudden stillness, the muffled air, felt almost like stepping into another world. She dragged the door shut behind her and collapsed into the straw-strewn dirt floor. For a long moment, she lay there, trembling uncontrollably, every joint aching, teeth clattering so hard her jaw throbbed. The smell of hay, leather, and animal musk filled her lungs, grounding her in a way the endless whiteness outside never could. The barn was dim, lit only by faint cracks where the wind slipped through the wood. She could hear the horses breathing, the soft rustle of movement. She was not alone. And then she heard something else, a sound that didn't belong to any horse, nor the creak of timber. It was a voice, low, steady, speaking in a language she did not know. The words rolled like water over stone, soft but carrying weight. The cadence was unfamiliar, unlike the sharp tones of English or the drawl of ranch hands. It carried rhythm, like a song not meant for ears but for the earth itself. Fear jolted through Evelyn. Her eyes flew open wide despite the exhaustion dragging at her bones. She forced herself upright, her limbs stiff, her breath ragged. Somewhere deeper in the shadows, she saw movement, a tall figure crouched near the horses, his head bent low as he spoke. The firelight, where had the fire come from, flickered faintly, illuminating his profile, long black hair, dark skin, the glint of something carved hanging against his bare chest. Apache. The word crashed through her mind, heavy as the storm outside. Every warning her father had drilled into her from childhood thundered back. Savages, thieves, merciless killers. They'll take everything you are, everything you have. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Her body screamed at her to flee, to run back into the storm, even if it meant death in the snow. But she could not move. Her legs were useless, heavy as stone. The man turned his head toward her, his dark eyes catching hers. For a heartbeat, the barn held no sound but the whistle of wind through the cracks. He didn't rise, didn't lunge, didn't bare his teeth the way her fear insisted he would. Instead, he simply held her gaze, calm and unreadable. Then, with deliberate care, he stirred the small fire at his feet, coaxing it to life, and spoke again in that low, foreign hum. Evelyn's body shivered violently. She hugged her arms around herself, pressing her knees to her chest, trying to create some semblance of safety. But her eyes would not leave his. The warmth of the fire beckoned her, even as every instinct screamed danger. The cold, however, didn't care for instinct. It gnawed at her, burrowing deep into her bones. Her lips had gone blue. Her fingers burned with the sting of frost. And she realized with a terrible clarity that if she stayed away from that fire, if she clung to her fear instead of the flame, she might not live to see morning. And so, trapped between death's chill and the presence of the Apache warrior, Evelyn's story began. The fire crackled softly, throwing uneven light across the barn walls. Evelyn's teeth chattered despite the warmth licking at her frozen skin. She tried to focus on the straw beneath her, the faint smell of horse sweat mingling with smoke, but her body betrayed her, trembling so violently that even the thick wool blanket Tohani had wrapped around her shoulders could not contain it. He didn't speak again at first. Instead, Tohani moved with deliberate care, adjusting the firewood, his muscles flexing beneath his bronzed, scarred skin. Every movement seemed purposeful, measured, as if the storm outside were merely a nuisance rather than the life-threatening force it had been. Evelyn watched, mesmerized despite herself, the fear in her chest coiling tight, then loosening slightly as she realized he meant no immediate harm. When he finally spoke, it was in that low melodic tongue she couldn't understand. His words rolled across the barn like river water over smooth stones, strange, strong, and strangely soothing. She opened her mouth to ask him to speak English, but her voice cracked, a brittle rasp swallowed by the fire's crackle. Instead, he reached toward her with hands that were large, calloused, and warm. He held a tin cup, steam curling from its rim, and tilted it toward her lips. "Drink," he said in careful English, each syllable deliberate, almost measured. Like he had chosen it from a small list of words he trusted. Evelyn hesitated, the bitter air of the barn still sharp in her nostrils, the fear knotting her stomach. Yet the warmth from the cup, from his hands, was irresistible. She tilted the cup with trembling fingers, letting the hot liquid slip past her lips, scalding and sweet at once. She shivered, leaning into the heat, her body craving the comfort he offered. He crouched closer, the firelight casting his strong profile in sharp relief, long black hair catching the flames, tribal jewelry glinting across his chest. Despite the harshness of his presence, there was a gentleness in the way he adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, tucking her in like she was fragile, like she might shatter if left exposed. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered, her voice quivering. The words sounded pitiful even to her own ears. Tohani's gaze met hers, steady, dark, and unreadable. There was no hint of malice, yet his silence was heavier than words. He nodded slightly, a small gesture, then returned to tending the fire, his hands skillful and sure. He moved as though he had done this countless times, saved someone from the cold, brought warmth where the wind had taken it. Evelyn tried to push herself to her feet, to act brave, to regain some measure of control over her body, but exhaustion chained her. Her legs refused, numb from the cold, and she sank back against the straw, shivering violently. Tohani noticed immediately. Without a word, he adjusted the blanket again, his hand brushing her shoulder in a gesture that was both firm and protective. She froze, not from fear this time, but from the strange, new sensation of being cared for. The barn was quiet except for the low hum of the storm still raging outside and the crackling of the fire. Evelyn's ears picked up every small sound, the snort of a horse, the rattle of a loose plank in the wall, the faint hiss of the wind sneaking through gaps. And beneath all of it, the steady rhythm of Tohani's breathing, calm, controlled, grounding. "Where did you come from?" She finally managed, voice shaking. Her words hung in the air, fragile as the snowflakes she had left outside. Tohani's jaw tightened. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes darkened in thought, and for a moment, Evelyn thought he might simply turn away, leave her in silence. Then he spoke, voice low, measured. I follow the winter. It brings the lost. It brings the cold. It brings you. The cryptic words unsettled her, yet they carried a strange weight of truth. She had been lost alone and nearly frozen to death. Here he was, a stranger in the shadows, offering warmth and life. Every instinct screamed caution, but every fiber of her body whispered surrender, to safety, to warmth, to the undeniable pull of the human connection she had been starved of for weeks. She let herself sink further into the straw, letting Tohani's hands adjust the blanket again. The firelight danced across his features, showing the strength in his jaw, the hardness in his shoulders, and the gentleness in his eyes. Evelyn realized she would not freeze here tonight. Not with him. Not as long as he remained. Outside, the wind howled, snow drifting against the barn walls. Inside, a fragile peace had settled, one born of survival, necessity, and the tentative trust between a young woman and a man whose world was entirely foreign to hers. And in that quiet, Evelyn knew that her life had changed, though she did not yet know how far or in what ways that change would reach. The wind outside had eased slightly, but the barn was still a cocoon of shadows and flickering light. Evelyn pressed herself tighter into the straw. The wool blanket clutched around her shoulders like a fragile shield against the remnants of the cold. Her lips were blue, cracked at the edges, and every breath rasped through her lungs like dry paper. Tohani knelt beside the fire, his broad back flexing with each movement as he fed the flames. The firelight danced across his scarred chest, the tribal beads and bones of his necklace catching the glow in tiny sparks of warmth. His skin was bronzed, rough, and strong, each muscle defined like it had been carved by years of survival. And yet, despite the raw strength he radiated, there was a gentleness in the way he worked, careful, precise, almost reverent, as though tending the fire was a ritual he had performed 1,000 times. Evelyn tried to lift herself to her knees, shivering violently. Her arms trembled so badly that the blanket threatened to slip from her shoulders, leaving her exposed to the lingering cold that still seeped through the barn's cracks. Before she could steady herself, Tohani reached out and caught her by the elbow, his hand large and warm, anchoring her to the straw. She froze, startled by the intimacy, but the warmth from his touch spread through her like sunlight after a long winter. "Careful," he said, his voice low, measured, calm. The words were simple, but they carried authority, reassurance, and an unspoken promise that she was safe here, at least for this moment. Evelyn's heart thumped erratically. Every instinct screamed caution. He was a stranger, a man from stories she had been warned about, but the raw reality of her body's exhaustion and the relentless cold made her realize she had no choice but to trust him. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across his face, revealing the sharp planes of his cheekbones, the strength in his jaw, and the darkness of his eyes, which seemed to hold storms of their own dot as she leaned back against the straw, letting him adjust the blanket around her again. Evelyn noticed the subtle details of him scars etched across his shoulders, each one telling a story she would never know. The intricate feather tied into his hair that swayed slightly as he moved, and the faint, smoky scent of pine and embers that clung to his skin. She tried to inhale without shivering, wanting to remember every detail, every texture, every sense of life and danger intertwined. Tohani crouched lower, feeding the fire, and as he did, the heat radiated outward, reaching her frozen fingers and toes, slowly coaxing warmth back into her stiff limbs. She watched his movements with fascination, noting how effortlessly he worked, how calm and controlled he was even in the midst of a storm that had nearly killed her. There was a rhythm to him, a steadiness that made the chaos outside the wind, the snow, the biting cold feel distant, almost unreal. Her eyes lingered on him, taking in the curve of his shoulders, the tension in his arms, the quiet confidence in the way he moved. And then, Without thinking, she leaned forward slightly, seeking a little more warmth, pressing her forehead against the crook of his shoulder. The warmth from his skin radiated through her, melting away some of the fear that had gripped her heart since the fire had consumed her. Home. Tauhani stiffened slightly at first, as though surprised by the gesture, but he did not push her away. Instead, he remained still, letting her lean into him. The sound of his breath, deep and steady, filled the barn, blending with the crackle of the fire and the faint rustle of horses. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting herself be held not just by the blanket or the fire, but by him. For the first time in days, she felt something resembling safety. Not the safety of walls or locks, but the warmth of human presence, the quiet assurance that, at least for now, she would not be left to die in the snow. Time passed in a blur of heat and shadows. Every shiver, every small movement of trust seemed to stitch some part of her fractured spirit back together. The storm outside remained a distant roar, but inside the barn, she discovered a fragile sanctuary. Evelyn realized then that survival was not just about food, fire, or shelter. It was about connection. And in the arms of a man she barely knew, a man whose world was entirely foreign to hers, she found something deeper, more sustaining than any warmth of fire could provide. And though fear still lingered, curled tight in her chest, she knew, with a certainty she couldn't yet name, that the night had only just begun. Morning light crept through the narrow cracks in the barn walls, painting the straw-strewn floor in pale gold. The storm outside had eased into a soft flurry, snow drifting silently to cover the tracks left by the night's chaos. Evelyn stirred, blinking against the weak light, her body sore but alive. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the memory of last night's warmth lingering, almost like a dream. Tauhani sat near the fire, tending it with quiet precision. The embers glowed, illuminating his strong frame, the deep lines of his muscles, and the scars that marked his bronzed skin. His long black hair fell loose around his shoulders, a single eagle feather tied into the braid at the back catching the light. He worked silently, yet each motion spoke volumes: strength, discipline, survival. Evelyn could not look away, noticing for the first time the subtle tension in his shoulders, the careful way he moved, as though the slightest misstep could shatter the fragile peace between them. She tried to speak, her voice hoarse, but only a whisper emerged. "Who are you?" Tauhani paused, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment, the barn felt suspended in time, the firelight flickering across the sharp planes of his face. Then he spoke carefully, each word deliberate. "My name is Tauhani," he said. The name rolled off his tongue with a rhythm that felt both foreign and grounding. "I follow the winter. It brings the lost. It brings the cold. It brings those who need warmth." Evelyn swallowed, heart hammering. "Why? Why help me?" His jaw tightened, and he turned slightly, focusing on the fire. For a moment, silence hung heavy, filled only by the hiss of the fire and the soft movement of the horses. Then he spoke again, his voice low, weighted with memory. "Because last winter, someone left my sister in the snow. No one came. She never woke." The words struck Evelyn like a thunderclap, the image of a frozen, forgotten child settling into her chest. She had never considered the human cost of neglect, of being unseen in the wilderness. She pressed her fingers into the straw beneath her, trying to ground herself against the rising emotion. Tauhani's eyes softened slightly, but the scars of loss were etched deeply across his face. He seemed older than his years, carrying grief as though it were armor, worn over raw vulnerability. Evelyn wanted to reach out, to touch that pain, but hesitated, unsure how a stranger could bear such weight. She began, voice trembling. "I almost died last night, alone." "In the snow," he nodded, not interrupting, his gaze steady. You are here now. That is what matters." The simplicity of his words carried a quiet power, a lesson in survival and perspective that pierced her heart. She realized then that warmth was more than fire, more than blankets. It was presence, care, and the unspoken promise that she would not face the storm alone. Curiosity overcame her fear. You live like this? Alone?" Tahani's lips pressed into a thin line. "I am not alone. The land, the wind, the sky, they are my family. But there is always someone who needs me." His eyes flicked toward her, and for a heartbeat, vulnerability shone through the stoic mask. Evelyn's throat tightened. She had been trained to see danger, to trust no one outside her small world, but here, in the firelight, she saw something entirely different. Tahani's strength was real, yes, but so was his capacity for care, for sacrifice, for understanding the fragility of life in ways she had never known. She took a hesitant step closer. Will you teach me?" Her voice was barely audible. "How to survive in a storm, in the wilderness?" Tahani studied her, silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, the motion deliberate and heavy with significance. "You must learn, Evelyn. But first, you must trust." And in that instant, the distance between them shrank not in space, but in understanding. The night's fear had given way to fragile trust, a connection forged in shared survival and the unspoken acknowledgement of past pain. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, blanketing the land in quiet beauty. Inside, warmth lingered not just from the fire, but from the presence of one human being reaching for another. Evelyn realized, as she watched him move with quiet purpose, that survival would demand more than strength of body. It would demand strength of heart, and for the first time, she believed she might possess it if she could walk the fragile path Tahani had shown her, hand in hand with the man who carried his own storms like armor. By mid-morning, the barn felt like a world apart from the frozen wilderness outside. The snow had settled into soft, glittering drifts, covering the footprints Evelyn had left in her desperate flight from the burned homestead. Inside, the fire's warmth seeped into every corner, chasing away the lingering cold that still clung to her bones. Evelyn had found herself unable to leave her spot in the straw, though each breath she drew brought a little more strength back into her limbs. She watched Tahani as he moved, his muscles rippling beneath bronzed, scarred skin, the tribal jewelry around his neck and wrists glinting with each motion. There was a rhythm to him, a quiet power in the way he worked, a balance of strength and control that seemed almost untouchable. And yet, beneath that exterior, Evelyn sensed something fragile, something wounded that no fire could chase away. Evelyn began, hesitating, unsure how to breach the distance between them. "You carry a lot with you, don't you?" Tahani glanced at her from the corner of his eye, his expression unreadable. Then he let out a slow breath and turned fully toward her. His dark eyes softened, shadows of past pain and loss reflected in their depths. "Everyone carries something," he said quietly. "Some wounds are visible. Others lie beneath the skin where no one can see them." Evelyn's throat tightened. She thought of her father's ranch, her home reduced to ash and smoke, the sense of loss that had nearly crushed her in the snow. And yet, sitting here, watching Tahani, she realized that his losses were different, older, deeper, etched into his very being. She wanted to ask him more, to hear the stories behind the scars, but something in his stillness warned her to tread carefully. Instead, she wrapped her trembling fingers tighter around the blanket and tried to make herself smaller, invisible. But Tahani did not look away. He approached her slowly, deliberately, and crouched beside her. His bare arm, strong and scarred, rested lightly on the straw near her knees, not touching, but close enough that she felt the heat radiating from him. "Tell me," he said softly, "why do you fear?" The question hung in the barn like smoke. Evelyn's lips parted, but no words came. She had been afraid of the cold, of dying alone, of the unknown, and now she was afraid of feeling too much, of letting someone in who could change everything she thought she knew about safety. To survive, she whispered finally, I've learned to trust nothing, to trust no one. Tahani's gaze did not waver. And yet, he said, here you are. You survived. You are alive. And still, you feel. His voice was low, measured, carrying both challenge and understanding. Perhaps trusting is not weakness. Perhaps it is strength. Her chest tightened at his words, at the depth of their truth. She wanted to argue, to cling to the idea that survival meant solitude, that human connections were dangerous. But she could not. She had felt his warmth, his protection, the care in his hands and his presence, and the fragile truth was undeniable. She had trusted him, even without meaning to, and it had saved her. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the firelight flickering over Tahani's scarred chest, over the long black hair that framed his face, over the sharp, quiet lines of his jaw. Evelyn's gaze traveled over the contours of his arms, the steady, unshakable strength in his posture. She realized then that his strength was not just physical, it was the endurance of pain, of loss, of living in a world that had not been kind to him. And yet, he remained unbroken, a living testament to resilience. I don't know your story, she admitted quietly, but I see it. I see what you carry. Tahani's lips pressed into a thin line, and a shadow passed across his eyes. Then, slowly, he nodded. Some stories are not yet ready to be told. Perhaps in time. The weight of unspoken words settled over them, thick and intimate, like the smoke curling from the fire. Evelyn realized that connection was not always about sharing everything. Sometimes it was about witnessing, acknowledging, and surviving together. Outside, the snow whispered against the barn walls, a world still wild and harsh. Inside, amidst the firelight and shadows, Evelyn and Tahani shared something far more potent than warmth alone, a fragile, unspoken bond born of survival, resilience, and the recognition of wounds hidden beneath the skin. And as Evelyn leaned back into the straw, feeling the strength returning to her body, she knew that the storm outside might be relentless, but within the barn, and within the presence of the man who had saved her, she had found a new kind of shelter, one built not of wood or stone, but of understanding and quiet trust. By late afternoon, the storm outside had softened into a gentle whisper, snow drifting in lazy swirls through gaps in the barn walls. Inside, the fire crackled steadily, casting warm amber light across the rough-hewn boards and straw-strewn floor. Evelyn had moved closer to the flames, but she still clutched the blanket Tahani had wrapped around her hours earlier, as though letting go might release not just the warmth, but the fragile sense of safety he had given her. Tahani worked near the fire, feeding it with precise, deliberate motions. Every movement was calm and controlled, yet even in that stillness, there was a quiet tension that seemed to ripple through his muscles, bronzed and scarred, the tribal jewelry around his neck and wrists glinting with each subtle shift. Evelyn couldn't help but notice the way the light danced across his skin, tracing the contours of strength and endurance carved from years of survival. Her eyes lingered on him, captivated not just by his form, but by the quiet command he seemed to hold over the space around him. He was not just a man who survived the wilderness, he belonged to it, and yet, somehow, he had chosen to give part of himself to her. As she shivered slightly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, Tahani moved without a word, lifting it again and tucking it firmly around her. His hands were warm, calloused, strong and gentle. Evelyn felt the heat radiating from him, not just from the fire, and an unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, easing the tremor of fear and exhaustion she had carried for days. She began, voice barely audible. "I feel safe with you." Tohani paused, glancing at her, his dark eyes unreadable yet piercing in their intensity. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, acknowledging the truth in her words without breaking the quiet. "Safety is not given," he said softly. "It is claimed." "Together." Evelyn's pulse quickened. His words resonated deep within her, cutting through the fog of fear and cold. She wanted to ask him what he meant, to reach deeper into the mystery of this man who had appeared from the shadows to save her. But before she could speak, he shifted closer. Crouching beside her, the heat from his bare chest reached her, brushing the edges of her shawl as he adjusted it again. She inhaled, catching the scent of smoke, pine, and something distinctly him-earthy, wild, and compelling. Her heart pounded not just from fear or cold, but from the undeniable pull of proximity, the tension coiling between them like the firelight itself. "Evelyn," he said, voice low, almost reverent, "the world outside is harsh, but here you are alive. You have survived the snow, the storm, and yourself." His hand hovered near hers, almost brushing the blanket, almost brushing her skin, as though testing boundaries without crossing them. Her breath caught. She wanted to pull back, to retreat into the comfort of solitude she had clung to for so long. But she couldn't. The storm outside had almost taken her, but the warmth of this man, this stranger, had kept her alive. She realized that trust, even when forced by circumstance, could feel like life itself. Tohani's eyes softened, the quiet intensity in them giving way to something more tender, more human. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned closer, the firelight flickering across his scarred chest, across the tribal beads and bones that glinted like ancient talismans. Evelyn's hand rose slightly, almost unconsciously, reaching for the edge of the blanket, wanting to feel the presence of him without words, without promise, without fear. For a long, suspended moment, they existed in the quiet of the barn, the firelight, the drifting snow, the horse's soft movements outside, two souls caught between fear, trust, and the unspoken ache of human connection. And then, without warning, Tohani's hand brushed her shoulder, firm yet gentle, anchoring her to the present. Evelyn's breath hitched, her pulse surging as the warmth of him filled her senses. She leaned slightly into him, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the weight of safety, of presence, of something undeniably alive between them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent and endless. Inside, a fragile fire burned, not just in the hearth, but between Evelyn and Tohani, unspoken and undeniable. The barn, once a refuge from cold and death, had become a place of tentative trust, of heat and tension, of hearts beginning to thaw. And as Evelyn pressed herself a little, closer to the blankets and to him, she knew that the night still held challenges, still held danger, but for the first time since the fire had taken her home, she felt the spark of something she hadn't dared to hope for: warmth, connection, and life. The last light of day slipped through the barn's cracks, turning the straw golden under the flickering firelight. Outside, snow continued to fall in soft, relentless drifts, covering tracks and erasing the evidence of a night that had almost claimed Evelyn. Inside, the barn was quiet but for the soft crackle of embers and the occasional movement of horses, their breaths clouding in the cold air. Evelyn pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the warmth of Tohani's presence even before glancing at him. He had been silent for a while, crouched near the fire, adjusting the flames with steady hands. Every muscle in his bronzed, scarred body flexed and relaxed with natural grace, the tribal beads and bones in his jewelry catching the firelight in tiny flickers. His long black hair fell in wild waves across his shoulders, framing his intense, dark eyes. She wanted to speak, to break the silence, but her voice felt fragile, fragile as the snowflakes drifting outside. Instead, she watched him, memorizing the quiet strength in his posture, The way the firelight kissed his skin, the slow rhythm of his breathing. It was mesmerizing, grounding, and for the first time in days, she felt her pulse slow, her heart steady, her mind clear. "Tohani," she whispered, barely audible. "Thank you for everything." He turned his gaze toward her, the shadows of the firelight dancing across his sharp features. For a long moment he said nothing, but the depth in his eyes spoke volumes. Then he moved closer, not intrusively, but with deliberate care, crouching just beside her. The heat radiating from his bare chest brushed against the blanket she clutched, and her breath hitched at the nearness. "You survived," he said quietly. "That is all that matters. The storm, the snow. It brought you to me. Not by chance, but by need." His voice carried a strange weight, a combination of certainty and reverence, as though her survival validated something unspoken he had carried for years. Evelyn's heart ached at the intensity in his words. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me." Tahani's jaw tightened, a flicker of emotion crossing his face, unguarded and fleeting. He reached out slowly, adjusting the blanket once more, his fingers brushing lightly over her shoulder, not a touch of possession, but a touch of protection, of acknowledgement. Evelyn shivered, but this time it wasn't from cold. It was from the raw, undeniable heat that radiated from him, a warmth that went beyond fire or blankets, reaching deep into her bones. The wind outside rose briefly, rattling the barn boards, but inside, a fragile sanctuary had formed. Evelyn took a deep breath, letting herself lean slightly closer, drawn to the steady strength of Tohani's presence. She could feel his energy, controlled yet powerful, like a force of nature tempered by compassion. "You," she began, voice trembling. "You carry so much, and yet you give it to me, even when it must cost you." Tohani's dark eyes softened, shadowed lines of loss and survival flickering in their depths. "Strength is not measured by what we endure alone," he said slowly. "It is measured by what we do for those who cannot save themselves." His hand hovered just above hers again, this time letting the warmth of his palm brush the edge of her fingers. The simple proximity sent a thrill through her, anchoring her to the present in ways words never could. Evelyn's chest tightened. She realized then that this moment, this fragile bond forged in firelight and snow, was more than survival. It was trust, connection, the kind of human warmth that could heal wounds the storm had opened. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out, letting her fingers touch his hand lightly, almost experimentally. Tohani's gaze softened, a faint nod acknowledging the unspoken bond between them. For the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt safe. Not just from the cold, not just from the storm, but from the overwhelming isolation that had haunted her since she had lost everything. Here, with this man who had appeared from the shadows of her worst night, she had found shelter not only in the barn, but in the strength, resilience, and quiet humanity of Tahani. Outside, the snow fell softly, covering the world in a serene white blanket. Inside, the firelight flickered across bronzed skin and straw, across tattered shawls and tribal beads, and across two souls who had survived the storm together. And as Evelyn rested against the warmth of the fire and the presence of the man who had saved her, she understood something essential. Survival was not just about enduring the cold. It was about finding someone to endure it with, and in that silent, golden glow, amidst flickering flames and drifting snow, Evelyn and Tohani had found it.